In 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed the death sentence of an African-American man convicted in Georgia of killing a white police officer during the course of a robbery. The defendant had submitted data to the Supreme Court supporting his assertion that defendants in Georgia charged with killing white victims were more than 4 times as likely to receive a death sentence than those convicted of killing a non-white victim. In another 5-4 opinion, the court concluded that although the study indicated a discrepancy that appears to correlate with race, the evidence did not require overturning the sentence of death. It should therefore surprise no one that Michael Addison's sentence to death in the New Hampshire case previously discussed is black while his victim was white. It's interesting to note that New Hampshire has gone decades without having a capital case, then found itself with 2 cases running simultaneously, one with a black defendant, Michael Addison, and one with a white defendant, John Brooks. It's also interesting to note that the white defendant was sentenced to life without parole. As Gary Young put it in a recent essay, never having considered solidarity with blacks and Latinos, white Americans see them not as potential allies, but as perpetual enemies. Economic disenfranchisement. Aggravating the racial component driving mass incarceration is the pronounced economic disparity between those going to prison and those who are not. Following a marked decline through the 60s, the chasm between rich and poor, irrespective of the metric used, has increased significantly. In the U.S. today, the Gini coefficient, a measure of the distance separating rich and poor, is comparable to that of China. Although one's civic status should not be a function of his or her economic participation, that's precisely the nature of American society today, where the poor, from whose ranks most prisoners are drawn, remain largely voiceless with respect to elected officials who pass the laws that disproportionately affect them. The resulting dichotomy has created a cult of celebrity worship and corporate greed that need not be revisited here, but that has produced a culture in which a balance sheet, athletic ability, or star power determines an individual's worth as a human being. Ironically, it was Adam Smith, the titular father of the free market, who observed that this disposition to admire and almost to worship the rich and powerful, and to despise, or at least to neglect persons of poor and mean condition, is the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. With respect to the current state of those moral sentiments, the disturbing ease with which prisoners are written out of the civic process is no less brutal than ancient Greek punishment of banishment from the polis. Those deemed morally reprehensible by the majority forfeit any consideration, banished as they are to facilities that the majority justifies by filling them with those it despises. Absent is any sense of collective moral outrage over such an asymmetrical treatment. David Cole reminds us, our addiction to punishment should be troubling not only because it's costly and counterproductive, but because its race and class disparities are morally unacceptable. Indeed, it should be troubling. But it is not. Such an egoistic philosophy threatens the fabric of society for a number of reasons, most prominently the lack of social cohesiveness that binds citizens together and promotes mutual recognition as human beings. Where there is no society, there is only competition, and scant regard for underperforming men and women on the margins, similar to the brutish world envisioned by Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan. We need look no further than the former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher for corroboration of this kind of social evisceration. There is no such thing as society, she says. There's only individual men and women and families. The obstacle to abolition, thus, lies in both the policies of the state and the language used to justify them. To be successful, we must therefore address both. Strategic engagement. Concomitant with the intrinsic hostility toward criminal defendants and the misperception that abolition means a modern storming of the Bastille by contemporary sans-culottes and setting loose the monsters inside into prey on innocent children and unsuspecting adults. Educating the public about precisely who's in prison and why must be our priority and should include expanding the public's awareness of the benefits, both moral and economic, of abolition. This will naturally involve organizing like-minded groups that currently work at cross purposes, both locally and transnationally. In a recent essay in the JPP, Kenneth Hartman provides what is perhaps the clearest example of this challenge. While many groups currently work for the elimination of the death penalty, they feel compelled to advocate for a sentence of life without parole to replace death as a punishment, simply because the public demands a harsh alternative. According to Hartman, the California prison system already holds 3,864 prisoners serving life without parole. How then does one argue for the abolition of prisons when sympathetic organizations are advocating their persistent existence as placeholders to stop the government from killing people? We do not quarrel with the ultimate intent deconstruction of the current system of those organizations. We suggest that when exploring abolitionist strategy, modifying current models can be a helpful beginning. Here, Julia Sudbury's discussion of her group's approaches in California provides a lucid example of what can be done and what might yet be done. Sudbury founded Creative Resistance 10 years ago at Berkeley, a turning point in abolitionist work in the United States. And yet, although we've been active in many prison reform activities for over 2 decades, neither of us had ever heard of CR until Sudbury's essay appeared in the Journal of Prisoners on Prisons. Whether CR's absence of national publicity or our lack of awareness, the result is the same: isolated struggles in geographical pockets where unity should be employed. This confirms Judd's observations regarding the difficulty in organizing and sustaining shared purposes in a country as large as the United States. As Judd puts it, social democracies function best in small, homogeneous countries where issues of mistrust and mutual suspicion do not arise so acutely. Sudbury describes her preliminary work in exploring the ways in which prisons had become embedded in the political and economic landscape. This is, of course, mandatory if we are to understand fully the nature and the adversary and the consensual silence supporting mass incarceration in order to develop coherent responses. Without, however, an orchestrated educational program designed to explain abolition to a skeptical public, the results will always be the gloomy reality Sudbury describes, and I quote, "Despite our best efforts, the use of imprisonment as a catch-all solution to social problems from poverty to addiction has become more, not less, entrenched." Unquote. To counter and potentially reverse this trend, we should, as noted, first undertake a rigorous examination and explanation of the nature of prison abolition in order to assuage public fears. The corollary is a concession to the skeptics and ourselves that modern prisons hold some individuals who must be physically restrained in some cases for the duration of their lives. A noteworthy example of this tactic is President Obama's intent to close the military prison at Guantanamo Bay. During his campaign, the president cited examples of men who'd been swept up in the incarceration frenzy of the two-war front in Iraq and Afghanistan, only to be subsequently cleared of any offense that warranted imprisonment, including minor association with questionable organizations. That number, as we write, has reached 560. The government's recent decision to close the prison and transfer 100 of the remaining 198 prisoners to a maximum security prison in Illinois carries with it the implicit assumption that some of the prisoners cannot be freed. Although the move marks a watershed moment, it has been met with vigorous opposition. Representative Mike Pence, Republican from Illinois, invoked the tired counter that moving the prisoners and closing Guantanamo will put the public at risk. Senator Roland Burris, Democratic Illinois, countered that he had full confidence in the safety and security of the new facility, a sentiment echoed by Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, who added, "We believe that this is in service of our country."